see. All right, yeah, I think let's dive in and use this time together. So good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I am Julia Di Benigno. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Management. It's my great pleasure to be moderating our session today, featuring a conversation with Claude Grunitzky. In terms of format, so I'm going to be moderating and posing some questions to Claude for about the first half hour, and then I will open it up to all of you to use the raise hand feature to ask questions. Throughout, the chat will be on, so please feel free to put your reactions, questions that might come up in there. If we don't catch it during the moderated conversation, we'll definitely try to get to you at the end. Many of you are going to recognize Claude as the case protagonist in every MBA and executive MBA who comes through here reads your case as part of our Power and Politics course or session on networks. Where we learn about your early career in life. So I think some of us feel like we know you a little bit, and so we're so happy to have you here, to learn from you, to see kind of where you're at now, what we can continue to learn from you about. In terms of a bit more of a bio on Claude for those less familiar who might be joining today, he's currently the CEO of the Equity Alliance, a new fund dedicated to providing capital to venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in America who are women or people of color. He's also the founder of two media companies, Trace and True Africa. His latest venture, True Africa University, launched in partnership with MIT, is aiming to become a Pan-African learning community committed to accelerating Africa's sustainable development. I think I shared in some of the announcements a link to a webinar series, and I can post that again in the chat for any students interested. And Claude, as we learn in the case, has a really unique background, raised between Togo, Paris, London, New York, speaks multiple languages, and these unique life experiences led to his unique philosophy around transculturalism, the subject of a book he authored in 2004. He's a graduate of London University and MIT Sloan, where I'm also a proud alum, and is served as a trustee on multiple different foundations and institutions. So, it's so great to have you here, Claude. Yeah, thank you for making time to be with us today.
Thank you, Julia. What a warm welcome. I'm so happy to see so many of you at your lunch break. I'm in the south of France, so it's almost dinner time for me. So we're in sync almost.
It's Zoom world. No, we're so happy to have you here. And since we learn about your early career, and in the case we leave off in 2012, and so at that time, you're thinking about launching what ended up becoming True Africa and getting funding from Google. You've since been involved in leading or being a part of many multiple mission-driven ventures, and many of our students and those in our community are interested in working for or starting their own mission-driven ventures. So we're really excited to learn from you there. And in particular, throughout your career, you've worked to increase opportunities for Black people and people of color. And I'm really curious to learn how the events of the last year that have really drawn increased attention to urgent issues around racial justice related to the Black Lives Matter movement, related to COVID's differential impact on communities of color, and how that's impacted you and the focus of your work.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I feel like we've been living in a parallel universe over the last year, many of us, right? Everything is different from what it used to be. For me, what's different is the level of attention I've been getting from people who are major decision makers across various industries. And it's almost, I get selected for, shortlisted for boards all over the place, whether it's nonprofit, for profit, and everybody kind of started reaching out in May after George Floyd was murdered. And my reaction, because I've learned to be really honest about this, is, I've spent my entire career on these issues. I've been doing this for more than 20 years with a kind of laser-like focus on race relations, gender relations, equity, equality, and I try to do it initially just through media, but I realized that this message could be relevant across other industries as well. So I'm very involved with various philanthropies, as you mentioned, Julia. I'm also very involved with various arts organizations, but I really felt that the way to move the needle was through access to capital and education. So having chosen those two new industries for me, because it's kind of new, because I'm a media guy who's now an edupreneur, as well
Yeah.
as a venture capitalist, I just felt that by focusing on capital, the best way to create sustainable lives for people of color and people who've been traditionally disadvantaged because the odds were stacked against them was to find new ways and new pathways to economic empowerment. And that's why I decided to partner with Dick Parsons and a few Wall Street titans and very successful entrepreneurs to launch the Equity Alliance, because I just wanted to make sure that uh, we put the money where people actually really needed it and can actually help to create new communities that would be a lot more um, that would be thriving, quite frankly. That's really what I've been trying to do with the Equity Alliance, and we're off to a great start, and that's very exciting. And but because my sole focus has never been just the United States, I also decided to focus more deeply on some of the major issues in Africa. And when I kind of did a bit of soul searching and realized the areas in which I could add value, it certainly was not media. True Africa, the media venture that did get funded by Google, it never really took off the way my previous media venture Trace did, because there's many reasons, right? The media is in crisis, and the work that I've done throughout my career, which is promoting better and more positive images of people of color and making that more inclusive. A lot of other people are doing that now. I really felt that it would be a lot more interesting to do something in the field of education. And our dream with the True Africa University is really to provide quality education to thousands and eventually millions of young Africans. So I'm constantly navigating both worlds, the worlds of America and the worlds of Africa, and trying to find a way to be useful through these new ventures.
Yeah, no, thank you for that update on what you're doing now and how it relates to current events. With the Equity Alliance in particular, what's distinctive about the approach that you're taking there in terms of providing capital to entrepreneurs and of color and women?
Well, with the Equity Alliance, what is distinctive is that it is a fund of funds that is providing funding to this next generation of venture capital fund managers and to some really good mission aligned companies that we identify within their portfolios. So my job with the Equity Alliance is, number one, to reach out to these very rich and powerful people that I've kind of met on Wall Street and elsewhere, and ask them to put a bit of capital into this so that they could do something about leveling the playing field. So that was my first job. That was the fundraising bit. It's a $30 million fund. And so we've been successful in that respect. But then with that capital, it's really about identifying the people who really need the money. If you look at the asset management industry, for instance, only 1.3% of the actual assets managed have gone to funds that are managed by people of color. So that's, again, this is 400 years in the making, but I felt that this industry in finance could be an area where I could play a role because I'm a first generation founder and I'm an entrepreneur myself. So I'm not a traditional venture capitalist in that way because I come from lived experience. I've bootstrapped. I've known what it's like not to make payroll. I've known what it's like not to make rent. I know the difficulties that a young entrepreneur faces. And so I try to share some of that expertise, not just with the young entrepreneurs, but also with the fund managers who support them. And so, I'm a bit of a conduit between the very successful entrepreneurs who are quote unquote in the stratosphere and some of the entrepreneurs and fund managers who are more in the grassroots across America. So that's been really interesting as well. But what's also been interesting for me over the past year, to go back to your previous question, is learning to say no, because a lot of people just woke up and realized that they needed a Black person on their board. Just all of a sudden they woke up in May and needed, and of course I'm always on that short list. And what took you so long was my immediate reaction. And saying no to a lot of people, I've also been educating them on the process and and being intentional and as opposed to being reactive to current events. And so it's a long process. I've been doing this for more than 2 decades. And I think my role now is to help to explain to some of the powerful people that the world has changed and they need to be on the right side of history.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, with that now, people suddenly waking up and having to say no, like how do you decide what to say no to?
I really look at the history of the organization, number one. I look at the leadership of the organization, and I also look at the ambitions of the organization. And I find that a lot of people are confused because they're just looking to check a box. So tick that box of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, but done. Others will tick a box that will be CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I've always been talking about systemic change. And so my role really is to point out the things that are dysfunctional within their organizations from what I know, because I usually always end up knowing at least one or two people who work there, and kind of bring and help to elevate the voices of those people who have felt marginalized within those organizations, whether it's large corporations or philanthropic organizations, or even just kind of even smaller nonprofits whose leaders do have their heart is in the right place, but they just have no idea how to go about identifying the right women for their board, identifying the right people of color for their board. They just realize that they need at least one person in order to save face.
Right, right. So distinguishing between who's doing it to check the box, more symbolic, versus really interested in real change.
Exactly, and you usually end up the litmus test is asking them why they're doing it. You know, it sounds like a very, very simple question, but you'd be surprised by some of the answers you get. You know, many people can't even understand. They can't really explain why it is that they're quote unquote now committed to DEI.
Okay, right. It's just suddenly there's attention on it. I better do something.
Yeah.
No.
Well, there's also an economic imperative for them, because obviously ESG has become much more important, right? And so they realize that it could hurt their bottom line. And some people are actually really honest about that. And I appreciate that honesty when they tell me that they're doing it because they want to be in compliance with some of the new ESG regulations that are coming through. Yeah, I get it. I'd rather that answer than the fake answers of people who are a little bit, misaligned.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing all that. I wanted to circle back a little bit to when you were talking about your new work with True Africa University. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there, and in particular the webinar series, which I'll post the link to here in the chat in case anyone's interested.
Great. Yeah, True African University, thank you so much for posting it. It's we have a webinar every Thursday at noon Eastern, and it's just been wonderful. We started on March 4th, and literally every week, I've been inviting somebody who I feel is a major change maker within the sphere of future development in Africa. And we've had people like Jeffrey Sachs, the famous economist at Columbia University. Tomorrow we have Kofi Bio, who's an architect in Ghana. And again, we look at the future of Africa and not the past of Africa. And specifically, we pick various industries, whether it's agriculture, whether it's cultural industries, whether it's climate change. And we look at the people who are actually the change makers. And we're really looking at how how this is the takeoff moment for Africa, and what does it take to train a new generation of leaders who can help to transform the continent. Because I just been, as somebody who was born in Africa and who grew up in Africa as a child, and who's always kind of kept really strong ties to Africa because my mom's always lived there and a lot of my family's lived there, and I've always gone back to Togo and to various parts of Africa. I've always been very disappointed by the horrible leadership that we've had in most countries, and also by the very uneven kind of trade agreements, in the way that that people consume goods that are coming from different parts of the world. I was kind of disheartened by the way China was building a second continent in Africa by exploiting many Africans, and specifically with people like Kofi Bio, who's an architect and urban planner. We're going to be challenging the social discourse. It's about how can a new type of building and urban planning and architecture change people's lives in Africa? How can we create affordable housing for millions of people who've kind of lived in these shanty towns forever? And ultimately, when I say that we're trying to rewrite history and reinvent the continent, it's about what can we do as actionable steps over the next 10 years with the next generation of leaders to totally transform the continent. So it's a project of a lifetime. If we're successful in ultimately educating millions of Africans, starting with a master's in sustainable development that we're going to be launching with next year, then I think we'll have done something very significant for Africa and for the world, quite frankly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in hearing, you're shifting out of, as you started with, out of media into now education, into yeah, providing funds. How, we sort of analyze the really incredible way you're able to build and leverage mutually beneficial, strong relationships to do that. How has your network or relationship building changed as you've moved into these new spheres?
Well, it's interesting because it's about the strength of relationships, right? And I've always um, maintained various levels of relationships in what I will call concentric circles. So I have my close friends who are the close ties, people I speak with all the time or email with all the time. And there's a second concentric circle of people who I'm very simpatico with, but we're not best friends, but we're in each other's lives. And then there's a third concentric circle, which might be people that we might have met once or twice, and we might email each other on our birthdays and maybe a happy new year, but it doesn't go any further than that. But what I've done is there are certain people in that second concentric circle that I've liked very much, and I've always kind of wanted to work with. And specifically, when I was running Trace, I had just received $15 million in funding from Goldman Sachs to grow my small kind of magazine into a proper media company. And I knew that the most powerful person in media at the time was Dick Parsons. Dick Parsons at that time was running Time Warner, which was at the time the largest media company in the whole world. And I just approached him at an event and just wanted to get to know him. And because he's a generous and very authentic guy who's got the measure of the game, he identified me as somebody who was hungry, who really wanted to do something with Trace. And I've stayed in touch with him for these past 14, 15 years. And then what happened was, uh, you know, when the whole kind of crisis around George Floyd and people reevaluating the state of race relations in this country kind of happened in the spring, he called me and he said, well, we really finally should be able to do something together. And that is how the Equity Alliance idea kind of came about. It wasn't me approaching him with that idea. It was more him thinking that I'd be the right person to lead that effort. Why? Because I met him in a totally different setting, which was a media setting. But because I've consistently stayed in his life and I've always kind of admired him from afar and found ways to meet with him from lunch every time he was available and, or could make time for me, it took, again, almost 15 years for us to become business partners. And it's great because it's about making sure that second concentric circle, the people who you really do care about, that you stay in their lives, because you never know what that could turn into.
Sure. No, it's such a wonderful story to then see it all kind of come full circle now that you're able to work together now. And how about with True Africa, with university, in terms of leveraging your network there?
Yeah, True Africa University is a very different story because after I sold Trace in 2010, I decided to become a student again. And I decided to become a Sloan Fellow, Julia. And I went to Sloan because I felt like I had made a lot of mistakes in my first tryout as an entrepreneur. Even though I was successful and I was a young entrepreneur who raised 15 million from Goldman and was able to have an exit, I felt like I made a few mistakes along the way, which were just due to lack of experience and immaturity at times. And I also could feel that media was changing. Media was already in crisis, and Facebook was already growing very fast at the time. Google was getting bigger and bigger in media, and I could just feel that my take on media, on traditional media, was going to be nothing more than just a shrinking pie. And I needed to reinvent myself through digital technologies and understand really how to scale, through network effects. And so going to MIT as a student, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy. Like, you should be thinking of starting your next company, was the immediate reaction. And I just felt like I should be humble and listen. And so what I did was I became much better listener. And in the process of doing that, I built really strong relationships across MIT. So they really helped me to think through what this new True Africa Media venture could be. And so that was good too. But the True Africa Media venture was never successful in that way. And it was never successful because, as many of you know, Google and Facebook together take up 68% of all the digital advertising. So, it's very, very difficult for every other news organization out there to be, fighting for the crumbs or the remaining 32%. So I realized that True Africa as a media venture was not going to be successful as a venture, which was fine because we were still fulfilling our mission, which has always been, since I launched in 2015, to champion young African voices all over the world. But I felt at the same time, as we were developing Trace and kind of seeing the roadblocks and seeing the difficulties and the challenges with True Africa, the media company, I felt that there might be a much bigger ambition there. And in my discussions with a lot of the senior leadership at MIT, specifically with Sanjay Sarma, who is the vice president for open learning at MIT, I realized that online learning was going to become really big. And this was even before the pandemic. And so we started kind of ideating on what it would look like for Africa, where everybody who wants to belong in the middle class wants a smartphone. That is the marker of belonging, is a smartphone. So how do we find ways to distribute kind of custom content to young Africans who want to learn with the new tools of technology? And so True Africa University was incubated at MIT with the support of MIT, with funding from MIT and other people, and I funded it as well. And so now we have this ambition to create this wonderful platform that will be hopefully what Khan Academy is. My ultimate hero is Salman Khan. What he did with Khan Academy is absolutely stellar in my opinion, and I'm hoping to replicate some of that success with the African continent with True Africa University.
It's great to then see how a whole other network you were embedded in then is launching this really promising new venture. And I'm thinking you're saying you're understanding the potential of online virtual learning even before COVID hit, but now all of us living through this last year with everything being online, like how did you have to adapt in terms of especially launching this webinar series and launching things during this time, relationship building over Zoom? Like how has that impacted how you approach your work?
I think a lot of us in March of last year realized that a lot of the things we knew were wrong and we would have to adapt very, very quickly. So when we were first imagining what True Africa University would be, it came really as a reaction to a necessity on the ground in Africa, because the population growth in Africa is so explosive. I always say that there's more children born in Nigeria alone than in the entire European Union. And Nigeria is currently 200 million people, and by the end of this century, it's going to be 800 million people. It's going to be the second most populated country in the world after India. That's just one of the 54 countries in Africa. So there's all these young people, 60% of the population is under the age of 25, and they're growing so fast that there's no way that the governments are going to be able to afford to build schools for all these people. So the necessity that I spoke about was, well, there's not going to be enough classrooms for all these people. So what they do have is a smartphone. And so how do we find a way to really distribute great content through these smartphones by adopting what we call a blended learning model? And so the first 6 months of the pandemic were all about acceleration. Let's really learn from this pandemic and the disruption that came with pandemic to really help to understand where things are going in Africa, and to create tools that are going to be relevant to this next generation of underserved students. And that means webinars, that means summer schools, so that means master classes, and that means this Masters in Sustainable Development that we're currently developing with a partner who is a leader at the United Nations, as well as with MIT. So it's not about just copying and pasting what's available in the Western world. It's about looking at the realities of connectivity, even in Africa, and the difficulties that students have to get on a Zoom like this, and looking at what can we do to mitigate those the risks that come with launching a venture with some of these shaky economies, by being really smart about distribution and by focusing on competency-based curriculum.
No, great. No, that's really helpful to hear, and I mean, quite a challenge you're taking on. And this kind of relates to another topic I had wanted to cover with you around the idea of transculturalism that you've been advancing for a long time with the book that you wrote, and also your own background, kind of navigating so many, having kind of deep understanding of a lot of different worlds in a way that makes you very unique, to bring kind of value. And I'm just curious how you get drawn that if you're still you still see transculturalism as kind of core to who you are and how you approach your work, and how that plays out for you.
I have to say that those years between 2016 and the end of 2020, I'll just even be more specific, November 2020, I'll say maybe right up to January 6th of 2021, were years where I really questioned my whole theory on transculturalism. Because when I started writing about transculturalism in the early 2000s, it was a reaction to the fact that I met a lot of people like myself who were citizens of the world, but I would define myself now more as a serial immigrant. You know, I carry 3 passports from 3 continents, and I navigate all these different worlds all the time. And I was meeting more and more people who were interested in the rest of the world. When I came to America 20 years ago, I started meeting a lot of people, not just in New York, but Americans who, for the first time, were really curious about the world, which I had not seen before. And so I felt that there was a movement around what I'll just call this cosmopolitan curiosity that manifested itself in music, in film, in fashion, and art, and the digital platforms that emerged in the mid 2000s really accelerated that. And then of course, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 was really the capstone. That was really a dream come true for us, because we kind of felt that it was the beginning of a new era, which was about fairness, discussion, dialogue, and advancement, in a very inclusive way. And then the swift reaction that came with the election of Trump led me to question my whole belief in transculturalism, because it wasn't just Trump in the United States. Earlier in 2016, it was Brexit in London, which is a city that I know very well, having lived there. And then it was here in France, the rise of Marine Le Pen, a lot of these kind of very nationalistic, xenophobic, populist candidates who started rising all over Europe, all the way to Poland, all the way to Hungary. And so I started questioning my own beliefs and the theories around transculturalism, thinking that I might have been a little bit too idealistic. And now, with the election of Biden, because I always start with what's happening in the White House, because I think it pretty much affects everything around the world. Yeah. And Kamala Harris, I'm hopeful again, because I feel like there needed to be a moment of reckoning. And I feel like a lot of people felt that us Black people or gay people, just got too much in the Obama years. A lot of people felt that, maybe there was an unfair kind of system that was promoting minorities a bit too much. And that's something that people felt in the UK even, and which is a big explanation for some of the Brexit vote. And so I try to understand why so many people retreated to that kind of basic nationalism, right. America first and everything else. And without getting too political, I feel like we needed to kind of cross that bridge to really fully understand how far still we needed to go in order to reach a state of true equality and access to opportunity, which is, to me, the single most important thing. I've been fighting my whole career for access to opportunity for people who are underprivileged.
Yes. No, I mean, absolutely. Like it seemed, a question I had for years around if you were still as optimistic about transculturalism, given the kind of backlash or the movement toward more nationalist, explicitly kind of anti-global sentiments. I mean, do you have thoughts? I mean, now the election of Biden, but I mean, do you see kind of more hope, I guess, toward more of a multiculturalist, transculturalist kind of movement again?
I do. I think that it's ebbs and flows, obviously, and America has a very complicated history with race in particular. We could have an entire different colloquium on that. But, it is going to take a while, because, if we just even look at the results of the election, for instance, we just look at the vote of white America. Well, yes, Trump did win by a landslide if we only counted those votes, right? If we only counted the votes of white Americans, he did win by a landslide. So what does that mean? I'm not going to retreat into this mode of just thinking that those kind of voters don't get it. What I'm interested in, why is it that they keep thinking in this way?
Yeah.
Why is it that so many people still support the Confederate flag? Why is it there's still so much resistance to a lot of these racial justice initiatives that are being promoted at the federal level and at the corporate level? And now that I'm in a position to influence some very, very important people who are in the stratosphere and who do have major decision-making authority, I'm going to use what I've learned, what I've seen, and not just what I've read, to help to create lasting change, which is also ultimately my goal.
Yeah.
By again focusing on people of color, because that's my modus operandi.
No, absolutely. In looking at the time here, I want to make sure, I already see a question in the chat that I have a chance to kind of open up to questions from everyone who's on today. So if you could use the raise hand feature or add something to the chat. I think I'll start by turning it over to, I see there's a question from Aris, if you want to unmute yourself there, Aris, and ask your question to Claude.
I'm sure, yeah. Claude, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm just going to reiterate what I've written down in the chat. What is your view on providing value to relationships? How do you approach this whole matter, and how do you go about providing value to your relationships in your network?
Oh, I have well, it's a great question that I've been asked so many times that I'm going to try to answer it in a different way. When I was trying to build relationships, and I was this penniless immigrant trying to be a media entrepreneur in New York City, I didn't know anybody in New York City. I didn't have a Yale degree. I didn't have a Harvard degree. I didn't have a family that had ties to media or to entertainment or to finance or to entrepreneurship in any way. I identified the people who I felt could be instrumental in helping me to further my cause, which was really, again, racial equality through media. And so the people that I identified, I had researched what they were doing. And when I got to know them, you sometimes just waiting in line, just like I did for Dick Parsons. Every time Dick Parsons speaks, he's the chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was the former chairman of Citigroup. He's an important guy. So every time he speaks, there's going to be 10, 15 people waiting in line to speak with him. But, I had researched his work and his interest. And in the way that I built my relationship with him, it wasn't as if I was just asking him to do me favors or help me out or introduce me to this or that person. We got into a real dialogue where I was teaching him things about Africa that he didn't know. He's somebody who's always been interested in Africa, who's traveled across Africa, who's done business in Africa. And, I added value on that end. There wasn't much that I could teach him on the media end, but I added value on that end. And it was always a two-way street. And those are the kinds of relationships that I find really interesting. And what I find really difficult is a lot of people who are just so transactional about the way they try to build relationships. They don't provide any value because all they do is ask. And New York is a transaction city, so I get it. But I always wanted to make sure that the relationships that I was building, which I'll call non-networking, because I think it's very different from networking, networking is just accumulation of business cards and emails. I'm into actually building relationships by providing value through knowledge and insight on specific areas that my interlocutor might be interested in. And conversely, I'm very, very direct in the ask. What is it that I need from them? And why is it that I need that from them? And so I think when you're really honest in that way, specifically when you're dealing with important people, it mitigates the fuzzy kind of weird zone where you don't really know where you stand in the relationship.
I think he's back on mute. No, thank you for sharing that. I see another hand from Kalichi. I'll let you unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Claude. Thanks so much for your talk. Over spring break, I was part of this global network for advanced management, actually based out in South Africa, University of Cape Coast, and it brought together a lot of the bright minds across the continent who are at UCT Business School. And one theme that kept coming up was this idea of purposeless education in I'll just kind of paint a picture of what that looks like. So my country, Nigeria, I'm Nigerian, I was born and raised there. we have a ton of educated people. I'm hard pressed to see that education is necessarily our problem. But the big question here is how to like because we find that the fundamentals are missing. So you have a lot of educated people, more educated people than what to know what to do with. So the basics in terms of infrastructure and the power structures that actually make this educated people flourish is totally lacking. So I'm curious to know if True Africa University is looking to address this just basic fundamental issues that kind of like put a ceiling over what education could actually materialize practically.
Yeah, Kelechi, thank you for that question, because I have to say, Nigeria is a country that has a lot of educated people, right? Every time I speak at business schools around the world, specifically in English language countries, there's always going to be a lot of Nigerians. Because the culture of education has always been very, very important in Nigeria. But what you find is, as you said, a lot of people are educated, but they're not educated for employment, and they're not educated for what I'll call entrepreneurship. They're accumulating all these degrees and there's these fancy degrees, but they don't actually know where the economy is growing. They don't really know where the change forces are. They don't really know what to do with that degree, just because that degree is not adapted to the realities of the current marketplace. And then the other thing too is Nigerians, many of them are really good entrepreneurs, but many of those best entrepreneurs are not necessarily the ones who are most educated. It reminds me of our Nana Benz in Togo. We actually had this True Africa University MIT webinar last week about that. The Nana Benz in Togo, who became some of the wealthiest women in Africa from Togo, because they were very astute at becoming distributors of the wax print fabric that is kind of now everywhere in Africa. They would, from Lomé, Togo, where I was born, they would distribute these fabrics that were actually manufactured by Vlisco in the Netherlands, and they would distribute them all over Africa. And a lot of these women, they really couldn't. Many of them were almost illiterate, but they really were very good at counting. And so I think that what's needed now is a sort of a mix between education that is drawn by real competency, by real societal change forces that are changing these economies in Africa, and more kind of soft skills, which we'll call them, which are about emotional intelligence and understanding very complex situations from an African perspective. And I think that if we stop trying to replicate what Oxford University is doing and what HEC is doing in Paris, or what Yale might be doing, and try to do that in Africa, I think we could create a real made in Africa set of curriculums that could be really adapted to the realities of job creation and kind of broader entrepreneurship on the continent at the moment. And that's what I'm banking on. And that's been wonderful with my dialogues with MIT, because MIT is not trying to do MIT Africa. They're like, you created as an African, and then we will help you with the tools and the methodologies, because we know how to do that. But with respect to the content and the very specific African mindsets that are needed to thrive in the new economies, then you have to lead, and you have to find the people who can lead the way on that as well.
That's great. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other hands. Other questions for Claude? Yeah, please, Felix.
Yeah, sure, Claude. Thanks for making the time. Really appreciate it. So I'm originally from Ghana, and just to follow up on Kelechi's question, from your experience working across industries globally, do any particular industry stand out for you in Africa, and with respect to having the competitive edge to, raise Africa economically in the future?
Yeah, Felix, I have to say, a lot of the traditional industries that people have focused on are not necessarily the industries of the future, right? And so if we look at, say, energy, so many people have been coming to Africa because the fossil fuels, and they would just come, and these big companies, Total, they would just come and literally just look at Africa as a resource for certain fossil fuels. And if you look at, say, mining, for instance, a lot of people came to Africa and made a lot of money, whether it's in South Africa, Guinea, other countries, even my own country, Togo, with phosphates. I don't really necessarily believe in the future of those industries. I'm much more a believer in, say, renewable energies and how we could kind of make solar really widely available across the continent. Just to focus on, say, the energy sector. You know, conversely, agriculture, which is 70% of the jobs in Africa, you know, that is ripe for reinvention. It's not an industry per se, but we have to really look at it as a sector that is ready for reinvention through better kind of mechanical tools and that you know that will increase productivity while keeping it sustainable. And then if we even look at transportation, for instance, it was really interesting to hear Jeffrey Sachs talk about how Africa could leapfrog the whole car movement, and how everybody wanted a car in the 20th century, but maybe the 21st century will be different kinds of mobility, different kinds of electric cars. And so I think that if we look at the future industries that could transform Africa, now we can start finding real solutions, as opposed to always copying the models of what's been done successfully in the West or in China. I think that we need our own model. And I'll just end with manufacturing, for instance. It really kills me every time on the African continent, and I look at the food that we eat, that so much of it is imported. You know, I'm looking at chocolate, you know, and that's imported. And we have our cocoa farmers right there, and they've never actually even tasted chocolate in their whole life. And this is what they do. This is their livelihood. And so I think that if we can start manufacturing more in Africa, whether it's chocolate, whether it's wax prints, you know, the fabrics that used to be manufactured in the Netherlands, whether it's smartphones, I think that now we're going to be creating the jobs that Africa really needs for the future.
Thank you.
I think I saw a hand from Abosede, but it went down very quickly. Did you have a question? Lost connectivity there. Let's see. I know we're pretty much at time. If there's any other burning questions, it's been so great to have you here with us, Claude.
Thank you.
Let's see. I see a hand from Nikki. If we're able to stay a little longer there, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry for me to jump, but it's such a pleasure to have you with us today, Claude. I really loved how you described your relationships as concentric circles, and as a result, you have such a range and depth to your collective network and with global reach and scale. And so I was wondering if you had sort of a similar approach or like a framework to how you share and promote learnings from different regions to help solve like other complex issues.
Yeah, Nikki, the way that I do that is by bringing different people into the room, people who would have never met before, because I see myself as perhaps a connector between many people who would have never met before. I'm able to do that by in a very transcultural, in a very deliberate transcultural manner, by bringing different perspectives to solve each issue. What do I mean by that? With the True Africa University project, we're bringing the perspective of MIT, we're bringing the perspective of African companies, we're bringing the perspective of African educators, and we're also bringing the perspective of the United Nations. These are very, very different mindsets. And I find myself in this role of the convener, because I'm connected to all these people in various ways. I'm probably the only person who can bring them into the same room in this way around this very, very specific task. And I've learned to do that because when I was running my media company, Trace, I had a magazine, Trace, which you read about in the case. And that was, I used to throw parties every month to promote the new issue. And the way that I threw parties was I would invite people from, uptown, downtown, Brooklyn, Black people, my gay friends, Goldman Sachs bankers, the rappers, who were up and coming from the Bronx. I would bring them all into the same room because I felt like people needed to be in the same room in order to interact. Because I felt also coming into New York that a lot of people just wanted to be with people who look like them. A lot of my Black friends just wanted to be around Black people. A lot of my gay friends wanted to be with their gay friends. And that was problematic to me. So I made a conscious decision to be that connector who would bring into the same room and into the same dialogue and into the same conversation people from very, very different walks of life in order for them to find some sort of common ground. Of course, then my driver, my motivator was hip hop culture and the way that hip hop was gonna, as a subculture, was gonna change the world. You know, I really had a strong belief that hip hop was gonna change the world, and that's what I led with at the time. But now that I'm leading with access to capital on one end, and on the other end with education, I use the very, very same techniques of being the convener, and the more diverse the perspectives, the better the outcome.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Any final questions for Claude here? All right, well, I think I'll wrap up. I mean, I think that last question is such a nice culmination of, I mean, this is something we talk about in the case, just how masterful the idea of bringing such diverse people together, but around a common cause and around some, you know, rallying point that can, you know, sustain so many people with different views and different backgrounds. But thank you so much for making the time to talk with us today during our lunch hour. Really happy to have heard from you and to keep learning from you and get an update on your life. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Marie. Thank you all. It was wonderful being with you. Enjoy your lunch. I hope to meet some of you soon.
I'm seeing lots
Bye.
of thank yous in the chat. All right, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Before you leave, Claude, I didn't want to take up like too much of your time, but